We're going to examine in quite a bit of detail the communist theory and practice of revolution, particularly as applied to the United States. This will be the strategy as taught by them and advocated by them in their own manuals, in their textbooks, and in their schools. Now, here is a piece of vicious communist propaganda that perhaps some of you have seen. It's called The Crusader. It's written by Robert F. Williams, one of the organizers of the Revolutionary Action Movement. The strategy for violent revolution calls for chaos, anarchy, mass confusion and panic among the people, a crisis in government, and then, out of the vacuum, the sudden seizure of power by communist-led guerrilla bands. In this issue of The Crusader, the communists call not only for extensive chaos within the cities, but for putting to the torch every village, every forest, every field, and every barn. The plan is for raging fires from one city to the next. The Crusader explains how to set up sniper units in crowded metropolitan areas.
Now to Las Vegas, where police say that Stephen Paddock, who shot dead 58 people on Sunday.
Paddock is solely responsible for this heinous act.
Stephen Paddock.
Stephen Paddock.
Paddock.
Matt, we've been told by several investigative agencies that the man they believe fired these shots is 64-year-old Stephen Paddock.
The reason? Well, first, there's the value of sheer destruction. Secondly, it would force us to deploy our defenses and rescue units over the widest possible area. The communists point out that as long as our police and National Guard remain concentrated, they're invincible. But if they can be forced to spread out over the entire city and into the countryside as well, then they can be picked off from ambush one by one. A few years of violent, sporadic, and highly destructive uprisings will set the stage for the grand finale. After the stage is properly set through protracted struggle, America could be brought to her knees in 90 days of highly organized, fierce fighting, sabotage, and massive firestorm. The non-violent phase of revolution actually is more important to the communists and more potentially dangerous to us. Now, the strategy for this phase calls for the gradual transition of our government into a communist regime, done peacefully and legally, but under the banner of socialism.
Democratic socialists.
What is democratic socialism? The term democratic socialism was the most searched term on the Merriam-Webster's website.
For democratic socialism is on the rise.
Many of us haven't even considered the possibility that the communists might have another approach to their goal, that they might overthrow the government without force and violence, that they might in fact plan to come to power through means that properly could be called peace and politics, but they also refer to it as the socialist revolution. We're living in an era of two kinds of revolution, one violent and the other nonviolent.
I'm Julia Brown. For 9 years, I was a member of the Communist Party, serving as an undercover agent for the FBI.
It'll be necessary for us to examine rather closely the communist position on what they describe as the Negro question. The communists declared that the racial differences among our people constituted the weakest and most vulnerable point in our social fabric.
Our enemies were quick to find our weakest point for their attack. They knew that racial differences could provide them with an excellent wedge to divide our people.
By constantly probing and straining at this one spot, they calculated that eventually the cloth could be torn apart and that Americans could be divided, weakened, and perhaps even set against each other in open combat.
Their strategy simply has been to keep hammering on that wedge, to drive it deeper into our social structure, and deliberately to create new ones wherever they can. If all goes according to the communist blueprint, Americans will believe that the chaos and violence has something to do with civil rights.
They said in no unmistakable terms that the Negro people, because of their secondary social status and their predominant working class composition, offered greater revolutionary possibilities than any other cross-section of the population. To develop these possibilities, the communists proclaimed that the American Negro constituted a separate nation within a nation.
But the average American finds it's hard to believe that something as worthy and noble sounding as a civil rights movement could possibly be a communist maneuver.
Communism must be built with non-communist hands. The revolutionary accepts reform in order to use it as a cover for his illegal work.
Riots, demonstrations, street battles, detachments of a revolutionary army. Such are the stages in the development of the popular uprising.
The people of this nation were said to be oppressed and exploited by colonialist, imperialist, racist America.
Race relations are bad in America is at an all-time high.
Systemic racism.
Civil rights leaders. The massive amount of anti-Semitism and racism.
Whites and blacks now agree in almost equal numbers that race relations are bad.
Consequently, the Communist Party called for their liberation, their right to self-determination, to break away from the United States and to set up their own nation within our borders. But they aren't going to settle for just part of the United States. They want all of it. To take the United States, all of the United States, it'll be necessary, they say, to involve white people as well as black, to create a broad coalition, a revolutionary link between the civil rights movement, organized labor, peace groups, student dissidents, and in general, to escalate their revolution in America from race war to class war.
I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
By concealing the true communist objectives behind appealing slogans and pretended humanitarian goals, the conspirators are able to dupe hundreds of uninformed opportunists and misguided idealists into supplying the non-communist hands needed in the overthrow of this republic.
We can and must write in a language which sows among the masses hate, revulsion, and scorn toward those who disagree with us.
Members and front organizations must continually embarrass, discredit, and degrade our critics. When obstructionists become too irritating, label them as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic. Constantly associate those who oppose us with those names which already have a bad smell.
The recent groundswell of nationalism and even referenced Nazi Germany.
The founding father who wrote "All men are created equal" did not treat all men as equals.
On the white supremacist side and on the Nazi side.
Happy belated condemnation. I can't believe we did not see you condemn them sooner.
The association will, after enough repetition, become fact in the public mind.
By duping the American public into turning a deaf ear to the voices of warning because the topics were controversial or because the patriots themselves had been ridiculed as extremists, racists, fright peddlers, the conspirators were ready to move one step closer to their hidden goals by precipitating mob violence.
Now, here is a book that I think ought to be in every home library. It's entitled Color, Communism, and Common Sense by Manning Johnson. Now, as you can see from his photograph, Manning Johnson was a Negro, and he was also a member of the Communist Party. He joined the party as a young man because he honestly believed that the communists were trying to improve the conditions of his people. But after many years, Manning Johnson finally came to the realization that the communists weren't the least bit interested in improving the conditions of the Negro people. He discovered that instead they were merely planning to use his people, and these are his words, to use them as cannon fodder in a bloody revolution to destroy America. And when he woke up to this, he dropped out of the party and devoted the rest of his life trying to alert his fellow citizens of all races to the true nature of the Communist Party as he knew it to be from the inside. What has all this to do with the communist revolution in America? ladies and gentlemen, it has everything to do with it because the building of socialism is the communist revolution in America. It represents the process whereby our country can be moved gradually toward communism without the people even being aware of it. The public is to be pressured into accepting measures that will move the country gradually and legally toward communism, but without calling it that. The strategy of the proletarian revolution calls for the quiet conversion of our government into a communist regime, but under the banner of socialism. No matter what grievance we may have, real or imagined, no matter what national problems we may face, the communists seize upon these as excuses to build socialism. They have one and only one solution for all problems: more government, and then more and more until it's total government. But as far as the United States is concerned, you can be sure that it makes precious little difference. Both types of revolution are being used against us today. Both are enhanced by the presence of the other, and both lead to exactly the same destination.